Welcome back. In this video, we're going to actually call drawTextureRec to draw a section of our sprite sheet to the screen. We're going to initialize the variables in ScarfyRec and ScarfyPause. And we're going to update Scarfy's position using the Y component of the ScarfyPause vector2. Let's get started. So we're here in dasher.cpp. Now we have our texture 2D, which we've initialized with load texture. And we created a rectangle and a vector2, and these have their own variables, and we can access them with the dot operator. So let's go ahead and initialize these with some values. For rectangle, I'm going to initialize the rectangle's height and width variables. So we access those by saying ScarfyRec dot, and here are the four variables we can access. Let's start with width. Now width, we're going to set equal to the width of our texture, which is scarfy.width, divided by 6, because there are 6 images in this sprite sheet, and we only want the width of one of those. Now we can initialize scarfyrec.height by accessing the scarfy.height variable, and we don't need to divide that by anything. Now the rectangle also has an x and y, and that's going to be the x and y position that this rectangle's upper left corner starts at on the sprite sheet. And we can give those values zeros. So we'll say scarfyrec.x equals 0 and scarfyrec.y equals 0. And now the x and y components of the rectangle are both 0. Now for the ScarfyPause vector2 variable. ScarfyPause has an x and a y. Now we can set x, and I'd like Scarfy to be drawn at the center of the screen. Now we can use window width divided by 2, and this will give us the x coordinate of the center of the screen. But if I set Scarfy's x coordinate to this, then I'm essentially aligning the left edge of the Scarfy sprite to the center of the screen. But if I want Scarfy exactly centered, what do I need to subtract away from this? If you guessed scarfyrec.width divided by 2, you'd be right. If we subtract away half of Scarfy's width, then Scarfy will be exactly aligned in the center of the window. Now let's initialize scarfypause.y. If we're going to be using ScarfyPause for Scarfy's position, then what does the y need to be for Scarfy to be placed on the ground? Well, we're going to use window height, and we're going to subtract something. Can you think of what it is? You probably guessed scarfyrec.height. If you did, you're correct, because Scarfy's position is the upper left corner of the sprite, so we need to subtract the height if we want to put Scarfy on the ground. Now we no longer need the rectangle dimensions. We're now going to use the scarfyrec.width and height. So let's go ahead and remove those from our code. We also no longer need pause y, because we're going to use ScarfyPause for the x and y. Now that we've removed some of our variables that we've been using, you'll see a couple of red spots in the scroll bar. And you can scroll down to these red spots and see that these are errors in the code. And that's because we're now referencing variables that no longer exist. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see that we're using width and height in drawRectangle as well. We no longer need to use drawRectangle. Instead, we're going to use drawTextureRec. Now type the opening parentheses and you'll see the parameter list as well as the types of each parameter. The first is a texture 2D. We're going to pass in our texture 2D called Scarfy. Next is a rectangle designating which slice of the sprite sheet we'd like to draw. Remember, we called our rectangle ScarfyRec. Let's pass that in. Next is the position in the form of a vector2. And we called our vector2 ScarfyPause. Go ahead and pass that in. Next, we have a color to tint our sprite. Now, we don't want to tint Scarfy by any color, so we're just going to use white. Now, we would be ready to go if not for these errors. We're no longer using pause y, and we're no longer using height. Since we're now using these variables we've just created, it's up to you to fix our code to use these. So your challenge is to fix our code so that we use our new types. Replace pause y and height as we no longer have those variables. Instead, we're going to be using scarfypause.y for our y position and scarfyrec.width for the width of Scarfy's sprite. We also need to set the scarfypause.y variable every frame as we update the location using the velocity. Pause the video and fix our code now. Okay, we're back in dasher.cpp, and I'm looking at our ground check, where we're referencing pause y, which we've deleted now, so instead we need to use our vector2, scarfypause. And we can access the y variable using the dot operator. Now we're comparing this value to window height minus the height of Scarfy, which we can get from scarfyrec.height. Now we have no errors in our ground check. Let's scroll down to our next error where we're updating the y coordinate of our position. We're no longer using pause y, so we need to use our vector2, scarfypause, and we're accessing that y component again. Now that we're updating the y component of scarfypause every frame, when we call drawTextureRec and pass in scarfyrec and scarfypause, we'll be drawing Scarfy at the correct location. Now, before we test this out, I'm going to show you one last raylib function. Scroll all the way up to where we declare Scarfy. We're calling the loadTexture function. And every time we load a texture in a raylib program, we need to unload that texture at the end of the program. So scroll all the way down to our close window function call. And just above that, we're going to unload the texture using raylib's unload texture function. Unload texture takes a texture 2D. We're going to pass in Scarfy. Now, before we close the window, we're unloading that texture and shutting things down properly. Let's test this out. Click Run and start debugging. And here's our window. Scarfy is drawn exactly in the middle and on the ground, and if I hit space, he jumps, which is exactly what we wanted. So in summary, we used drawTextureRec to draw a section of a sprite sheet. We initialized the variables in scarfyrec and scarfypause by accessing those using the dot operator. We used scarfypause to update Scarfy's position, accessing the y component of scarfypause. So we now know how to use these new types that belong to the raylib library, the texture2D, the rectangle, and the vector2. Next, we'll work on cycling through the different sprites in the sprite sheet so that we can animate Scarfy. See you in the next video.